I'm Bob Surridge. I'm Vice President of Southport Historical Society, and thank you all for coming this morning. I was just checking on my phone here. My phone is telling me it's 10:03, so I'm actually a little late here. This morning, I'd like to introduce you. Why don't you come up here so people
Okay.
can see you?
Well, not that they won't get to see me enough.
Pat Kirkman. Pat is a former, maybe a couple times president of the historical.
I have forgotten. It's been so long. So many years.
She's retired now from the Historical Society.
Well, I wouldn't say that. You better watch out for your job.
Now she does things on Facebook.
Oops, excuse me.
And they're very popular. Very, very, as is Pat, popular. One of the things she does on Facebook, and these are really great stories, but they're called Stories Beneath the Silent Stones. And they are stories about families, individuals and families who are now residing in the Smithville Bearing.
And I have to do a lot of digging to get them out.
That's good stuff.
But it's fun. It's good research.
And then started to notice more and more, what do we call it? Seen from the Southport side.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool too.
Yeah, that's one of my fun things to do. I go around, I just go on a walk in Southport and take pictures, and then I put them on there for, in case you didn't get to go with me. Seen from a Southport sidewalk, and that's on Locals. If you belong to Southport Locals, which is a group, a free group you can join, then you get to see a lot of stuff about what's going on in Southport, and it has over 3,000 members, so it's easy to get in. And you don't have to pay anything.
Okay. And today Pat's going to talk about, I like the original title, History on a Stick. These are history on a stick are the markers that you see on the highways and on Bay Street. I think there's 3 or 4.
Oh yeah, you'll see them all.
But they all tell the local history and history of North Carolina. Okay? I'm going to pass this around. This is a sign-up sheet. Please just so we have a count, sign in. But if you'd like to have an email telling you what programs are coming up, you might also want to put your email on there.
Well, hey y'all. Hey y'all. Nice to see you all here today. And today we're going to step outside of Southport just a tad and move into Brunswick County. So the program today, it's highway history. And it all will be the signs that, you know what signs I'm talking about, those silver and black ones that you rush by on the highway or the streets and you think, now someday I'm going to stop and read that sign. Well, you won't have to do that because I'm going to show them all to you today for Brunswick County. And we will see how this program began with the highway signs, and also what ours are here in the county. And okay, Bob.
So what you do is break.
I just pushed that top button to go up one page up. Down. Got it. No, this one right here. Okay, we're all set now. If we did not have some sort of technical issue to deal with, because remember, we are the Historical Society and we all have kind of hair like this and minds that are like this, but okay. This is the North Carolina Historical program that they have here. And in 1935, the North Carolina General Assembly authorized the establishment of the North Carolina Highway Historical Marker Program. And this has, from that time forward, the program has been administered by a cooperative venue among the state agencies, and the North Carolina Highway Historical Marker Program is one of the oldest such programs in the United States. The advisory committee for this program is a group responsible for overseeing the program, of course, and the committee this is interesting, the committee is composed of 10 faculty members from four-year colleges and universities who are experts in one or more aspect of our state's history. So it doesn't tell us exactly which of those four-year colleges, but I have a feeling it might be Duke and Carolina and State and maybe Wake Forest, or it could be some of the smaller ones. Doesn't say, and it doesn't really matter because they're all experts in the state's history. Prior to 1935, the Historical Commission, the North Carolina Historical Commission, also in cooperation with some other organizations such as the Daughters of the American Revolution, etc., sponsored a small number of historical markers that were put up around the state. But then the state program came in 1935 and decided they would expand on that. And so the model for the program that we have here in our state is from Virginia because they started theirs in 1926, about 10 years earlier than we did here in North Carolina. So that, and as I said before, the silver and black markers have become a familiar part of our state's landscape since the first one was put up in place in Granville County on January the 10th, 1936. That was the first unveiling of one of these signs. Now there are over 1,500 state highway historical markers that have been erected, and at least one of these signs exists in every county in North Carolina. And anyone can answer this question except Musette. How many counties in North Carolina? We get to give you a new fact here. Musette, tell us. 100 counties in North Carolina. And so there's at least one sign in every county, and we have more than that here. We have 27 historical signs in Brunswick County. Okay, there's a little bit about the website. It's www.ncmarkers.com, and if you go to that website, you will get a lot of information. You can see over here on this side, you can go down to any county of the 100 counties in North Carolina and click on that, and then it will bring up all of the signs that are in that county. And then when you get to that county, you'll see what's on the other side on the website, which is a little bit of information about when that sign was put up and where it's located, and also an essay, a little bit of history behind the sign itself. So it's a good way to learn about all of the history of North Carolina if you got nothing else to do but sit around and go through. So you can start out with the first one and go all the way through. And if you're new to the state, you can learn a lot that way by going to NorthCarolinaMarkers.com, NCMarkers.com. So, as I said, we have 27 markers that have been installed in our county from 1936 to 2007, and we're going to take a look at those today. The first one was cast in 1936, and that was, I don't have a picture of that one, but it was, or I did, but maybe I'm, yeah, there it is, right up there in this corner. You see that? It's hard to see it from there. That was the first one that was cast in 1936, and that was about the life of John Penn, and that provides an early example of the American dream. He had nothing more than a rudimentary education. He rose through the legal and political circles to become one of 3 North Carolinians to sign the Declaration of Independence, John Penn. So the first marker was cast in his honor. And the last one, we will see when I get through telling you about all of these others. So let's see here. Orton, okay, halfway between Southport and Wilmington, along the west banks of the Cape Fear River, sits Orton Plantation. Now, we used to be able to go to Orton a few years back, but not anymore. The area is now Winnebago, and it was first settled in the early 1700s. Colonel Maurice Moore, there's another pronunciation for Maurice, Morris Moore, that he probably went by that one, if it matters. He first owned the land on which Orton Plantation sits before selling it to his brother, Roger Moore, who became locally known as King Roger. And it was because he did own so much land in the colonial days. And it was later developed into an enterprise that is one of the leading rice plantations in our county and in the lower Cape Fear. And Orton was about as far north as rice would grow, because we usually think about rice being down in the South Carolina, Georgia, down that way. But they were able to grow it here and did for many years. Local Indians destroyed the first house that the Moors built there, but in 1735 it was rebuilt and the family settled there. It was likely named Orton after a small settlement in Westmoreland County, England, which was the ancestral home of the Moors. The plantation is not open to the public now, but maybe it will be sometime. I think there's more information later about that. So that was number 1. Now you see up at the top D, which D and 3. This was actually the third one that was put up in the state. D are in our region. We're in Region D. If you go to the website, you'll see that all of the little towns and places in North Carolina are divided into these regions. So we're in Region D, so that's what the D means, and it was the third one put up in this region. So as we go through these, you'll see that. And then, of course, I'm not going to read all of these to you because you can do that. You're looking at them. And this one is on Highway 133 up around Belleville. So
don't equate to the counties. That's a separate boundary.
The what?
The region does not equate to a specific county.
No, it does not. You're right. Yeah, it encompasses a region, an area which could have some maybe sometimes it's some reason that word's not coming out. What county is nearby us? It starts with a B. Bladen County, yeah. And New Hanover, of course, is where Wilmington is. But if you go on the website, it'll tell you which places are included in D. Okay. Now, we'll look at the Stamp Act. This one is located also on 133 near Plantation Road in Winnebago. England was having difficulty maintaining order in the colonies. Can you believe it? And Parliament turned to economic measures such as the Stamp Act of 1765, which means that they placed taxes on most forms of paper in the colonies. Now, that was not manufacturing paper, but that was newspapers, letters, pamphlets, wills, anything that was written on paper had to have this stamp on it from England by their tax collectors that somebody had paid the tax in order to have that piece of paper usually recorded somewhere. So that was the Stamp Act. And the imposition of this Stamp Act drove some early colonies to the brink of rebellion. And we all know what happened after that. In February of 1766, North Carolina leaders led several hundred citizens through Brunswick town and Brunswick County, arresting some of the key officials who were collecting these taxes for paper things. And so this commemorates the Stamp Act.
Can I ask a question? It's the 2 miles southeast. Is that where the actual...
Yes, the actual site of where that rebellion happened. And when you see that, it will give you, and we'll see this on many of these state signs, it will tell you that it wasn't right here where we've got this sign up. Particularly, this is because you're passing by here, but it will tell you where you would need to go. So you would turn southeast and go 2 miles, and then you would find that place, whether it be marked or not.
Are they placed then on like state roads?
Usually, yes. Usually they are placed where more people will see them and where they'll be more recognized. That's correct. Okay. Next we have Fort Caswell, and we can see from the top, because we've already learned that we're in the D region, and this was the 8th one that was put up in our region, and this is for Fort Caswell. Fort Caswell is a masonry fort that was constructed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers between 1826 and 1838. So it took about, 11 to 12 years to build Fort Caswell. We can see that. We can see Fort Caswell. We look across the bay here, and it's on the eastern end of Oak Island. The name Caswell is for Richard Caswell, who was the first governor of the state. And that would be governor after we became a state, after we became independent from England, of course. Although never directly attacked, the fort, the guns often engaged Union warships during the Civil War, who were these ships, of course, blockading the entry into the river. Yet, despite their continual occupation throughout the entire conflict, not a single soldier was killed in action at Fort Caswell. That's an interesting fact, I find. And although several did die of disease, and one deserter was executed by a firing squad, but no soldiers were killed there in any kind of conflict. On January 17th of 1865, the Confederates who were retreating from Fort Fisher, that was when Fort Fisher fell, and basically the Civil War was over, at least in this area. The Confederates came up here to Fort Caswell, and they detonated the gunpowder magazines that were there and basically destroyed the guns, and also that would not go into Union hands. The next one is Fort Johnston, and that's just across the street and up the road here a bit. In 1745, Governor Gabriel Johnston ordered that the construction would begin on a fort at the mouth of the Cape Fear River, and that's where we are, to serve as protection for the lower Cape Fear and for the town of Brunswick. Remember that Brunswick town was our colonial town. Southport was not here, of course, or Smithville at that time, as we were earlier known. Fort Johnston was threatened in 1766 by armed American resistors to the Stamp Act. Again, that comes into play. From 1766 until 1775, the fort existed fairly peacefully and providing protection for the lower Cape Fear region. Why did we need protection? And then remember now, this is colonial days. This is a colonial fort built by the British because they did not want the French and the Spanish and other exploring countries from Europe coming into what the British, what England had already claimed here in the colonies. So with growing animosity between the American colonists and the British Crown, in the early 1770s, the fort did come under attack. So in May of 1775, that's just before the actual war began, Royal Governor Josiah Martin fled his palace at Newbern and also at Brunswick Town to seek protection. And so he fled to Fort Johnston, to our fort here. And a group of Whigs, political party, seized Fort Johnston in July of 1775 and burned it to the ground. So there was nothing left of Fort Johnston by 1775. That was their well, it was before we celebrated 4th of July, but we can go back that far and say, well, maybe that was a July celebration when they burned the fort down. But remember, they were the Whigs. So the torching marked the first active violence against the British in North Carolina. When I said, okay, we're not going to let you use this fort any longer. We're going to burn it down. And so as a result, there was not much action at the fort during the Revolutionary War. Arthur Dobbs is our next sign. He arrived at his post as royal governor. Remember, Josiah had ran away with the colonies on the brink of the war. And by the 1750s, he was responsible for about 500 Protestant Northern Irish families who had immigrated to North Carolina. And he was named the royal governor of North Carolina in 1753. Now, he moved to Brunswick in 1758. When I say Brunswick, I'm talking about Brunswick Town, where he built a home. And he encouraged the building of St. Philip's Church. And if you've been out to Brunswick Town, then you've seen the remains of the church there. He died in 1765, shortly before his scheduled departure for Ireland. He was retiring after 10 years of service for the British, for England, here in the colonies. And he is buried at St. Philip's Church in Brunswick Town. Now, there was an attack by the Spanish. Remember, I said that the fort was basically built here to keep the Spanish and the French out of the area. And from 1741, Spanish privateers, ships, preyed on the British shipping along the North Carolina coast. And in September of 1748, the Spaniards entered the mouth of the Cape Fear, which is right at the end of Howe Street, and cruised up the river. They did capture 2 vessels, and they landed up at Brunswick Town, taking the town. And the next day, the local militia, led by Captain William Dry, and that name will ring a bell with you here, because we have Dry Street, attacked the Spaniards, who fled to safety. They got on their ship called the Fortuna. And that was not a good idea, because later it took on fire and blew up. So there was no more Fortuna. And the Spanish left an estimated 140 people dead from their ship that they came in on. And most are from all of the conflict, not just Spaniards, and mostly from the explosion of the Fortuna. So in exchange for the loss of 1 colonist, they lost 140 people. Now, our next one is Robert Howe, and we know Howe Street. Robert Howe was a Continental Army general. He was born in 1732 in New Hanover County. He inherited a considerable fortune from his parents and grandparents, He owned several large plantations in the New Hanover and Bladen counties. And after Brunswick County was formed, he was elected to the Colonial Assembly, a post that he held for 6 consecutive terms. Howe's plantations were burned by the British troops, and he was the highest ranking officer from North Carolina to serve in the American Revolution. In 1786, he was elected to the House of Commons. However, he died on December 14th while traveling to the meeting of that body. And he led quite a colorful life. Sometime you will read about General Howe and his colorful life. Alfred Moore was born on May the 21st, 1755, in New Hanover County. He was the grandson of Colonel Morris Moore that we just talked about earlier, who built Orton Plantation. And he was also the founder of, Morris was also the founder of Brunswick Town. And he was the great nephew of King Roger Moore. And the king is kind of just a nickname for Roger Moore because he was kind of in charge of everything around at that time. Now, at the war's conclusion, we're talking about the Revolutionary War here, Moore began a lengthy career in public service, first as a state senator from Brunswick County, and then as Attorney General of North Carolina. And then President John Adams appointed him as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and he died in 1810. He's also buried in the graveyard at St. Philip's Church. Moore County here in North Carolina is named after this Mr. Moore. Now we're going to look at the North Carolina, South Carolina boundary, and this is on US 17, Highway 17. If you're going to Myrtle Beach, you'll see this one. It's referred to as the Carolinas by many today. We're kind of lumped together, North and South Carolina, as, oh, we're going to the Carolinas or moving there or whatever. But we have been separated since 1712, and King Charles granted the land of the Carolinas, both of them, to 8 men that he called the Lords Proprietors at that time. And they were given the Carolinas as a reward for their faithfulness to the king. 2 colonies grew and developed distinctive histories. I like to say that poor North Carolina is a valley of humility between 2 mountains of conceit, and that would be the Charlestonians of South Carolina and the first families of Virginia. So bless our hearts. We are just, that's kind of a North Carolina saying, if you want to adopt that and send it back to your friends wherever they are. But anyway, this dividing line began, it's about 30 miles below the Cape Fear River in southeastern North Carolina, and the line has been in dispute ever since it was established. So that's a whole different story. But you'll see this these 2 signs there together showing the boundary. The first post road in North Carolina was constructed in 1738 and 39, extending a road network that came from Philadelphia, where you folks are from, or nearby, to Williamsburg. And the exact route of the road through North Carolina remains something of a mystery. Why they had to do it that way, we're not really sure. However, it is known to have passed through Brunswick County to Charleston, South Carolina, where the road was completed that was begun in Boston, and the post road ran all the way to Charleston. So we do have a sign on US 17 that commemorates that, right also at the boundary of the 2 states. Charlestown. William Hilton left Barbados, which was owned by the British at the time, and had big plantations there. Mainly growing sugarcane, in August of 1663, and he sailed to Port Royal, which is now in South Carolina, and then up the coast to the Cape Fear, and he spent several weeks exploring and scouting out the location around here for a colony. And he did finally select a place to have a settlement, and the name of that place was called Charlestown, 2 words. And he erected a fortified compound that had several buildings on it, and within 2 years there were about 800 people living in the colony that he had established called Charlestown. Well, problems from within and from without led to the failure of this small colony, or 800 people anyway. These included some stress about who was going to be the leader, internal complaints and bickering and fighting with the nearby Indians. Remember, the British were not the only people on the land at the time. There were local Indians or Native Americans here. The settlers drifted away from Charlestown beginning in the fall of 1666, and a second Charlestown, backed by many of the same people in Barbados who had come to this original one here on the Cape Fear, arose on, guess where? The Ashley River in 1670, and this in time developed into the present day city of Charleston, South Carolina.
But you can tell your uppity cousins in Charleston.
Yes.
It all started here.
Right here. Right here on the Cape Fear River was the first Charleston or Charlestown. And if you're going up 133, you'll see some a sign, or it won't be a oh, it is. It's on 133 at the Town Creek Bridge, is where this one is located, and that's where that first colony was. And then they moved on down to South Carolina. Anybody got anything to say in between? Please speak up, especially Bob Musette, any of you that know some of our history here. Let's go back a minute to Orton Plantation. Now we've come a while longer because this is number 53 in our region instead of number 3 like the first one. And this talks more about the plantation itself. During the first half of the 19th century, the plantation passed through a series of hands, including Governor Benjamin Smith. And after the fall of Fort Fisher, the plantation house was used as a hospital by federal troops for their smallpox cases. And the house was abandoned for nearly 20 years after that. And then it was renovated in the early 1880s. In 1904, James Sprunt purchased the Orton Plantation, and these are names that, as you begin to learn more about the history of the area, the Sprunts and Benjamin Smith and so on and so forth, that will become more familiar to you. And he purchased Orton, Mr. Sprunt purchased Orton as a gift for his wife, Luola, and the Sprunts were responsible for further developing the house and the gardens as a regional attraction. And some of us who have been here at least 25 years or more can remember when we could go out to Orton, pay a small fee, and enjoy seeing, especially in the spring when the azaleas were beautiful, have a picnic and enjoy going out to Orton Plantation, small chapel and house there that could be toured at that time. But no longer open to the public, Lewis Moore Bacon, who is the current owner and a descendant of the Moore family, is restoring the whole area to its natural habitat and restoring the house. So perhaps someday in the future, near or far, we will again be able to go out to Orton. Sometimes if you go down 133 and you see it looks like the woods are on fire, but that's controlled burning to burn out the brush and the undergrowth, and that's part of owned by Mr. Moore or Mr. Bacon as part of getting that back to a natural habitat. So that's a little about the plantation itself. Now we're going to look at Brunswick Town, and it was located in the present-day Brunswick County. In 1726, it was named for King George I of England, who was a member of the German House of Brunswick. So that's where we get our county's name and Brunswick Town's name, because King George, who was ruling England at that time, was originally from Germany and part of the House of Brunswick and Hanover. The Brunswick-Hanover House and house, we're talking about family, in Germany, and that name of Brunswick and New Hanover County both come from that same beginning. So it was situated, of course, on the Cape Fear River. The town became the colony's first chief port for exporting naval stores and lumber to Europe, and that was a very important business. So there's a whole other program about naval stores, tar, pitch, and turpentine, and how that was the main reason, one of the main reasons that England wanted control of this area was our many, many, many pine trees and the economic value of that. So there's Brunswick Town. This is on River Road, 133. Near Orton Plantation. There's about 5 or 6 in a row there as you get to the entrance of Brunswick Town. This is one of them, along with the one I just showed you. Actual construction of St. Philip's Church began in 1754, as the church stood unfinished until 1759. The General Assembly authorized a lottery to provide funding for its completion. And so in July 1760, just as the church was being completed, the tower built for the belfry was struck by lightning, causing the roof to collapse. Now, when Governor Dobbs died in 1765, he was buried within the walls of the incomplete church. Dobbs' successor, Governor William Tryon, saw to the completion of the church. The church most likely was burned by the British in 1776 when they burned the rest of Brunswick Town. All that remains of St. Philip's Church are parts of its exterior walls and a graveyard. And it can be visited, of course, by going out to Brunswick Town, which is a North Carolina State Historic Site. It's very wonderful visit if you haven't been to Brunswick Town yet. And they do a lot of activities out there. Fort Caswell, we're back to that a little bit. There's another marker. This one is on 133, going out at, well, actually, yes, this is another one going out toward Oak Island. Fort Caswell was a chain of forts built for coastal defense. It was never fully armed, and up until about 1861, only a handful of U.S. Army caretakers garrisoned the post. In 1923, the War Department closed the installation and sold the fort to a Florida development firm who unsuccessfully attempted to convert it into a resort, complete with swimming pools made from the gun emplacements. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how old I am, because as a young child, I swam in one of those. Well, I didn't swim, I bobbed around in one of those swimming pools up on Fort Caswell that had once been a gun emplacement. Fort Caswell again went back into the country service in 1941. That was before I bobbed around, by the way. When the U.S. Navy purchased it for a section base. So during World War II, so at the conclusion of World War II, the fort fell into disuse once again. And then in 1949, the U.S. government sold it to the North Carolina State Convention, the Baptist Convention. I was a little Baptist girl. And for $86,000, the Baptists bought all of Fort Caswell. I think there were about 250 acres. Today, the fort serves as a retreat and conference center for churches and other groups affiliated with the Baptist Convention. And by the way, you can go out there even if you're not a Baptist. I remember growing up in Greensboro as a little Baptist girl and coming to Caswell. That was one of our great treats in the summertime, is to come and stay a week at Fort Caswell. But $86,000, can you imagine what that 250 acres of land is worth now?
Some people thought it was outrageous.
Oh, yes, that price, exactly. Yeah.
Some, really.
And it almost happened as a fluke because we had a local lawyer here in Southport at the time. We're talking 1949. I was born by then. What's the name? Susie's boss helped me. Mr. Pravat, who was a local lawyer here and a very big supporter of the Baptist Church here in Southport, just happened to see that the United States was getting ready to sell this property. It no longer wanted to keep it up, didn't need it anymore after World War II. And he has happened to see that in some writing a newspaper or something. And he got in touch with the Baptists in Raleigh and said, hey, this might be a good opportunity for us. And lo and behold, they did end up buying it for $86,000. So, God is good to his children. Bald Head Lighthouse. The original lighthouse on Bald Head Island was the first one authorized in North Carolina. Well, we have 7 lighthouses along the seven lighthouses. Well, why am I saying it anyway? Along the North Carolina coast that people still come to visit who love lighthouses. They want to see all the lighthouses. But Bald Head was the first one that was authorized in North Carolina, and it was damaged beyond repair in 1812. And the new lighthouse was constructed in 1817. And the new lighthouse is the one we call Old Baldy, and it's still there. It was the light itself was discontinued in 1935, and it is the oldest lighthouse on the North Carolina coast. And it was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1975. Old Baldy is distinctive for its 8-sided construction and also its mottled appearance, which was kind of, I guess, supposed to look a little bit like camouflage. But no enemy would blow it up or whatever. So this one is talking about what we call Old Baldy, and this one is right here in Southport, down on Bay Street. So look for this one when you go out today and pass by and say, "Oh yeah, okay." And this one stands 3 miles south, but you got to go over the water to get there. So remember that. Washington's Southern tour, George Washington, who we all know, Revolutionary War hero, elected the first president of the United States. By the way, most of this information I'm reading you comes from these essays that are on the website. So when you go to the website and you pull up these signs, then you will see this. This is the type of information you will see there. I didn't. I'm not using everything they said. Some of them are quite long, some quite short. This depends. He was, of course, our first president, elected in 1789, and he's, of course, one of the most celebrated figures in our American history. And he resolved to tour the United States to observe the political climate and culture, and to thank his supporters, and to instill a sense of unity in the new country. So this is not a new idea to go all over what United States there were at that time, to touch base with the folks. As such, his tour stops along the way became important landmarks in the areas that he did come to, and he spent 2 nights in Wilmington, and then he made his way toward South Carolina, into, of course, Brunswick County. And on April 27th, he was a breakfast guest in the house of William Galls, who is another important figure in our local history, about 10 miles from the state line that we've already talked about. So Washington, South Carolina, Washington slept here. Yeah. So.
Don't they have a tree they still call a President's tree? It's somewhere in that area. I've seen this thing.
I don't know.
It's huge oak, but I think they call it the President's tree.
It could be, and maybe it was at one of the plantations. That one might be in South Carolina, down around Brook Green Gardens.
Galls had the only brick house in Brunswick County.
Mm-hmm.
We stayed there. That's where Brick Landing got its name.
Okay, that's good to know.
Brick for his house there, the Galls.
There you go, another gem, another nugget. Yeah, footnote in history here. Okay, who is John Lapierre? Lapierre came to the Carolinas around 1708, and he's one of the earliest ministers of the Church of England in the colony. And in time, he made his way to St. Philip's at Brunswick Town, where he lived until his death in 1755. And he was instrumental in organizing over 20 churches back in that day. The Boundary House in Brunswick County earned its name because it straddled the boundary line between the Carolinas. One part of the building was in North Carolina, and another part of the building was in South Carolina. And in 1805, Benjamin Smith, who's very important here locally in Smithville, was also a governor of North Carolina, had a disagreement with his cousin, Judge Alfred Moore, one of those Moore fellows, and because of Alfred Moore's poor health, the matter was taken up by Moore's brother, Captain Morris Moore. We're back to Morris again, who challenged Smith to a duel. Now, since dueling was outlawed in North Carolina, they had to go somewhere else. So they and their seconds and their chosen physician fled across the state line to South Carolina, where duels were legal. And the duel took place on South Carolina soil nearby. Smith was injured, but recovered in a matter of a couple of weeks. So nobody died. Benjamin got a shoulder or a wound or something, got fixed up, and they went on. You know how cousins are sometimes. So, but now we have the Boundary House marker up on Highway 17 as you're going towards South Carolina. Russellboro was named for the British Captain John Russell, who was stationed off the coast of Brunswick Town. Now, in the fall, on a ship, in the fall of that year, William Moore, owner of Orton Plantation, sold Captain Russell a 55-acre tract of property, and Russell initiated the construction of an extraordinary home on this lot, but he died in December 1752 before it was completed. Dobbs had moved to Russellboro in 1758 Dobbs, another governor, not Russell, in 1758, finishing the house and adding several outbuildings. And we can still see the ruins of those today in Brunswick town. It was in Brunswick that the 73-year-old Dobbs met and married his 15-year-old bride, Justina Davis. Dobbs and his bride continued to live at Russellborough until, guess what? He died in 1765, and the property was relayed to his son, Edward Dobbs, who in turn sold it 2 years later to the next royal governor, and we're still back in colonial days, William Tryon, and eventually it was sold to William Dry. So, 1776, it was then that the elegant house of Colonel Dry had been destroyed by a fire, and the site was not rebuilt. And like the rest of Brunswick town, it fell into ruin. And shortly after the Revolutionary War, Brunswick town kind of just drifted away because things were happening up in Wilmington at that time. And so with all the damage that happened during the Revolutionary War, it was not rebuilt and not taken care of at that time. But now it has been, of course, rescued and is a state historical site. Now we're going to talk about Benjamin Smith, and this I wish it was down here in Southport, but it's not. It's up at Jackie's Creek Bridge as you're going up Highway 87 at Belleville. You'll see this marker about Benjamin Smith. He owned what is now Bald Head Island, and which was first known as Smith's Island, and I think still legally known as Smith's Island. He inherited that as it was a land grant to his family by the king in colonial days. He was born on January the 10th of 1757, came from a family of considerable wealth and social standing, and he was elected governor of the new state in 1810, and he served a single term, one term. That was back when governors could only serve 1 or 2 years, and then they were done, and somebody else had to come on board. Maybe that's still a good idea. All over, you think, politically, but whatever. Following his governorship, he returned to Brunswick County and to the life of a prosperous planter. His once enormous wealth, however, was increasingly ravaged by financial misfortunes, personal extravagance, and long-term debt obligations. So over the years, Smith had several residences in Brunswick County, at Orton, here in Smithville, at Belvedere, which was his plantation, and it was there that he entertained President George Washington in 1791. So we did have the president at least stop for a meal if he didn't spend the night at Belvedere. And it was in the dilapidated Smithville residence right here on Bay Street that he died a virtual pauper on January 26, 1826. And the Brunswick Inn at the corner of Atlantic and Bay was where the house was, and that's where he died. In 1859, Mr. Thomas, I think his name, came and bought what was left of Benjamin Smith's house there, and basically tore it down to the basement and rebuilt it. And that's basically what we see today at the Brunswick Inn, which is a private residence now. And we're almost through here, so stick with me. Josiah Martin, we've already talked about him a little bit. He was the last royal governor of North Carolina, and this marker's right down here on Bay Street, too, right in front of the Garrison lawn. If you're sitting on the lawn, you'll be reading this one. On June the 2nd, he arrived at Fort Johnston, and several British warships were in the bay at that time, laying anchor, and things were getting a little complicated here. So on July the 13th of that year, 1775, he took refuge on the HMS Cruiser that was resting offshore, and it was a wise move because 5 days later, as we've already heard, the militia wantonly, as he said, in the dead hour of night, set on fire and reduced to ashes the houses and buildings within the fort. And that's exactly what did happen. As a result, nothing happened much at Fort Johnston during the war, and Martin stayed on the ship out there in the harbor for several months, and he died in England. When he did get back to England in April of 1786. Daniel Russell, who was called the Maverick Republican, was born in 1845 at Winnebago Plantation, and he was 19 when he was elected in 1864 to the first of 2 terms in the state house, and he was elected a Superior Court judge, and he remained in that position for 6 years. He was a lawyer and a staunch Republican, serving the state Congress and 1 term as the North Carolina governor. And here's somebody we all know, I'm sure. I haven't heard the name. And this one is, again, on Howe Street, just before you turn and go 1 block west down to where the house is. Robert Ruark achieved popular success as a writer, and he wrote The Old Man and the Boy. And if you haven't read that, it's right out here in the library. You can get a copy, and you can also, they used to have it on tape so you could listen to it in your car or at home. He was, and this is, was said at the time it was written in 1957, that it would probably be one of the 5 North Carolina titles that would likely still be read in 100 years. So when it was written in 1957, that's been 50 years almost ago. So half of that time has already passed by, and people are still reading Robert Ruark's book, The Old Man and the Boy. It's about his relationship with his grandfather who lived here in the house, as you can see, that this marker commemorates. As a boy, he spent much of his time in his grandfather's house on Lord Street, and his reminiscences about those years formed the basis for that best-selling book that he had. He became a sports writer with the Washington Daily News, and he wrote over 4,000 columns over the years. And he also wrote 14 books, and many of those are here in our library as well. He died of a liver ailment and is buried at Palermo, north of Barcelona, Spain, because he did move and live there. And he was a heavy drinker as well, and he died in his 50s in Spain. Okay, Hurricane Hazel. On October the 15th, 1954, Hurricane Hazel made a landfall in southern Brunswick County and became the benchmark hurricane for an entire generation. Its landfall in North Carolina occurred on a full moon, high tide, and the devastation was widespread all across North Carolina. But nowhere was the impact more severe than on Long Beach, right here, present-day Oak Island, where a 17-foot storm surge swept away 352 of the 357 structures on the island. There were 5 structures left the next morning after Hurricane Hazel blew through Oak Island. and Southport. Hazel was responsible for 95 deaths throughout the United States, and including 19 in North Carolina. Its total impact on the Tar Heel State was $136 million, and that was in 1954, a considerate amount for that time. And Hazel remains the standard by which all other North Carolina hurricanes are judged. This is our newest marker, and it's on 211. If you're going out to the ferry, to the state ferry, you'll see this one. And some of us were there for the dedication and the unveiling of this. Stede Bonnet was the gentleman pirate. He was an unlikely buccaneer. He was born in 1688 in Barbados. Remember, we've talked about that before. And orphaned at a young age, but he inherited property, including a sizable plantation there in Barbados. And he held the rank of major in the militia. In 1717, Major Bonnet gave up his life among the planter elite there in Barbados, deserting his family. And we have heard it say that he had only daughters, a wife, and a mother-in-law living with him. And so he decided to desert all of his women and become a pirate. Why not? Instead of capturing a vessel, which most pirates did, he launched into his pirating career in the way which was he was accustomed to doing business, and that was you just buy one. So he purchased and armed a ship, hired a crew, offering wages to them if they would come with him and go a-pirating, and they did. And in August of 1718, he decided to come into the Cape Fear River and careen his ship, turn it over, so they could scrape all the barnacles off of it, because they had to do that periodically to keep it sailing. And so in the meantime, there was a captain down in Charleston who had been given the task of eradicating pirates along the Carolinas coast, North and South Carolina, and that was Captain or Colonel William Rhett. And that was his job. And he found out that Bonner was up here on the Cape Fear with his ship turned sideways. And in fact, if you go down, keep going down Moore Street, if you're going out towards the ferry, and there on the left-hand side, you'll see another monument, not one of these, but another one that tells about Stede Bonnet. And that's the creek right there was where he had his ship, because he had brought it in. Of course, it was much bigger than it is now. It's called Bonnet's Creek. So anyway, Rhett came up from South Carolina. He spotted him there. They had a fierce battle. It was ensued at daybreak, and Bonnet and his surviving crew surrendered after about 6 hours. They knew they had no hope, and the fight was the largest and bloodiest of pirate conflicts in the colony's waters. All but 3 of the captured crew were executed in South Carolina, and on November the 8th, Bonnet, who escaped, was recaptured and tried, and he was hanged in Charleston on December the 10th, ending the golden age of piracy in North Carolina. In fact, they left his body hanging in the Charleston harbor for almost a week as a message to others who had ideas of doing pirating along the coast. We have sometimes stories about, especially about the house where that Benjamin Smith built. That was now the, or has been the Brunswick Inn down on Bay Street at Atlantic and Bay, having tunnels underneath it that went out into the river so pirates could come and go in there. But pirating only lasted a very few years on our coast in the early 1700s. So the house was not even built, much less any tunnels going back and forth to the pirate ships. So when you hear that tale, you can know from your historical brain that you have now that, well, that wasn't true. The pirates are pretty much done for by that time. But anyway, it makes for good stories, and we have now completed our oh, wait a minute. There's one more. Fort Anderson. And this was used as a Confederate fort during the Civil War out at Brunswick Town, built on the same land out there. And the purpose for that fort was to hinder movement of the Union ships and to serve as a dropping off point for the blockade runners. Fort Anderson was built on the ruins of Brunswick Town and was originally named Fort St. Philip, after the ruins of the Revolutionary period church there, and the name was changed to honor George B. Anderson in the Civil War. So that does complete it, and again, I'll bring to your attention at the top D119, even though there are only 27 markers in Brunswick County, in our district of the D district, there are more markers, and this one came back to Brunswick County, number 119. So that's all I got to say about this and that and the other, and you can come back next month to another Tuesday Talk, and who and what in the world is it going to be, Bob, do you know?
Well, actually, we're going to take July and August off.
Okay, that's probably a good idea.
September to be about.
Okay, very good, very good. So we'll see you in September for Tuesday Talks. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Thanks everyone for coming.
The last one was in 2007. No more history.
Well, no, not any more history, but this group of people, these 10 scholars, they are the ones who decide if we're going to have new markers and where they're going to be and what part of our state history they are going to commemorate. So if you go on the website, they do ask if you have any suggestions or if you'd like to give them some ideas. They are willing to accept and look and listen.